you just have to start somewhere. Start with something that excites you, and don't worry about, you're going to make mistakes. I still today, I make cooking mistakes, and that's okay. The sense of accomplishment comes over time as you practice, and you will learn and you will get better.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 147, and my guest is Nevra Ledwon. Nevra is an IT professional who comes to life after hours with her food and health-related philanthropic work. She runs one of the DC area's largest farm buying clubs and teaches cooking classes for all ages. She is a passionate cook, inspired by a variety of traditional ingredients and cooking techniques from around the world. We've invited her on the show today because one of the quickest ways to get healthier is to eat a more nutrient-dense diet that you cook at home. On today's episode, Nevra talks to us about why we should bother cooking in the first place when prepared food is so readily available, how the creative process of cooking can bring you joy, and the benefits of meal planning. Before we get into the conversation, we want to pause and recognize our sponsors. Vintage Tradition Tallow Balm, the original whole food of skincare. Check out their new products, including a paperboard tube for lips and on the go. Visit vintagetradition.com to check them out. And Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced liver, organ meats, and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Nevra.
Thank you, Hilda.
So rumor has it you were on a farm recently making 50 pounds of butter. Is that right?
Well, yes, that's true. So I do some volunteer work helping an Amish farm, and I went to visit them, and it's a working farm, so there's always stuff to be done. And so I was chatting with them in the dairy processing room, and they were in the middle of making butter. And so I rolled up my sleeves and I said, let me help you. And so, yeah, we took the cream and we churned it, rinsed it, and then packed it, and we made at least 50 pounds.
This blows my mind. I've always admired people who can grab a surfboard and run into the surf or go snorkeling in the coral reefs of Australia. But I also admire people like you, Nevra, who can roll up their sleeves and help make 50 pounds of butter.
Well, it's kind of magical, actually. I mean, to just, it's a process that few people these days get involved in and experience. I mean, to take this cream and watch it magically transform into butter. It's like, it goes from cream to whipped cream to a little bit sort of cottage cheesy, clumpy looking. And then all of a sudden, from 1 second to the next, the buttermilk comes out and it's splashing everywhere. And suddenly you have chunks of butter. And it's something every household used to make themselves. And they used to have like in the 1950s, they had their Daisy butter churn hand cranked. And nowadays, nobody does that anymore.
And so it's almost hard for us to conceive that it can still be done.
It can still be done, but I think one of the questions people ask is why? I mean, why would you churn your own butter when you can just go to the store and buy it?
And what would you say to that, Nevra?
Well, I mean, so that gets to the whole question that I think Michael Pollan addressed pretty well in a book he wrote called Cooked, that, it's a question I've been thinking a lot about because I cook a lot, and people ask why. I mean, you can afford to buy the pre-made food. Why would you cook? There's so many dimensions to answering why cook. I think my first answer from childhood was, for me, cooking was freedom and independence and power. And what I mean by that is, so, I was, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and my family didn't have sweets in the house, and they didn't really want us to eat junk food or processed food, but they had milk and eggs and butter and flour and sugar. And we grew a lot of fruit trees. We grew figs and persimmons and quince and blackberries. And I stumbled upon this book on my parents' shelf called The Joy of Cooking, and I opened it. And it was just amazing. All these recipes for muffins and pies and cakes and pancakes and things that, food I dreamt of eating, but they never bought for me. And I thought, well, let me give this a try. And they didn't mind cooking. So I would bake the pies and apple dumplings. And it was just this amazing, empowering feeling, this freedom to create the food that I wanted. And then I had two younger sisters. And so it was my job to babysit them. So when my parents left, I would cook, bake, and my sisters would smell, for instance, the apple dumplings roasting in the oven, and they wanted some. And I figured out that, I could get them to do whatever I wanted if I offered, you can have some if you go and clean the bathroom or whatever chore I wanted them to do for me. So, that was sort of the power part. And I think as I got older, cooking became a source of joy. And I actually think, I think a lot about this, what I see around me as a depression epidemic, right? I feel like there's so many people, at least in my circle, in my community, and I don't think it's just my acquaintances, but I think it's all over, where folks are economically very comfortable. They can afford to hire people to fix the plumbing and repair the roof and make their clothes and tend their lawn, etc. And yet they're depressed. And I think that part of the reason for the depression might be that many people are missing out on the joy of creation, right? The joy of taking some raw ingredients and transforming them, as Michael Pollan says in the book, through fire, through air, through earth. He talks about fermentation, he talks about braising, he talks about sourdough leavened bread. Experiencing that magical transformation that food goes through when you cook, and that sense of accomplishment when you've created it from scratch and you've built upon the years of experience practicing and learning. And I think you can get it through other means also. You could build a treehouse for your child, you can knit some booties for your grandchild, but cooking is something that you have an opportunity to do every day. So it could become a regular source of joyous creation.
That's beautifully said. It reminds me of something that Wendell Berry wrote, saying something to the effect that we now choose to be consumers rather than creators. And I think there are a lot of companies out there that want to keep us consuming rather than creating. Because as long as we are consumers, we are making them money, we're buying their products. But there's a special kind of joy that you're talking about that comes from creating ourselves, isn't there?
Totally. And another reason I think people question why cook is that honestly, the economics don't make sense, because you are going to get more calories per dollar by going to a fast food restaurant, for instance. So if you're really just looking at how can I, get the most per dollar, cooking does not make sense, right? Because we don't have the benefit of the economies of scale that the big food processors have. We're not buying thousands of pounds of meat at a time. We're buying a little bit and then going through the trouble to cook it, and then we have to clean up afterwards. And so again, if I go back to that book that Michael Pollan wrote called Cooked, there's a couple of quotes in it, if I may. Maybe I can read a little section from it.
Please do.
Yeah, so he's got a different take on it. He talks about, I guess, three aspects of why cook. One is the health aspect, which you talk about in many of your podcast episodes, and many of your guests talk about that. So I don't think I need to get into that. But he talks about, for instance, the spiritual aspect. So he says here, quote, "The idea that food has any connection to nature or human work or imagination is hard to credit when it arrives in a neat package fully formed. Food becomes just another commodity, an abstraction. And as soon as that happens, we become easy prey for corporations selling synthetic versions of the real thing, what I call edible food-like substances. We end up trying to nourish ourselves on images." And then later in the book, he talks about what I think is the most powerful aspect of cooking, which is the social or the connection aspect. And he says, quote, "The decline in home cooking has undermined the institution of the shared meal by encouraging us to eat different things and to eat them on the run and often alone. The shared meal is a foundation of family life, the place where our children learn the art of conversation and they acquire the habits of civilization, sharing, listening, taking turns, navigating differences, and arguing without offending."
That's so profound and really needed nowadays. I'm so glad you shared it with us. And now, Nevra, I really want to get into the meat of this topic for those listeners who are feeling caught in that conundrum, for those who are feeling very much like they are consumers only and not creators, at least in this food realm. So we want to inspire them and help them get a grip on how simple it can be to cook. So tell us, Nevra, how did you get started in this?
Well, I got started as a child. Again, the motivation was to be able to eat foods that my parents weren't buying for me. So, for instance, a lot of my friends at school would talk about pancakes, and my parents never made pancakes. My mother is Turkish, and she did most of the cooking, and I think that's not exactly the common breakfast over there. So I opened the joy of cooking, and I loved reading this book, and they had a section on pancakes, and the first one I latched onto was the recipe for French crepes, and it wasn't that difficult. It was, you mix some milk and eggs, a little bit of flour, a tablespoon of sugar, some baking powder. You mix it together in a blender, and then you pour it into a pan with a little bit of butter. And the first few times I had the heat wrong, and a couple of them were a little undercooked, a couple were burnt, and then I got the heat right, and I made these delicious, wonderful, thin French crepes, and I would have it with jam that we made from the fruit that we picked in our yard, and it was just delicious. And I remember my parents liked it. They would enjoy it too. And you just have to start somewhere. Start with something that excites you, and don't worry about, you're going to make mistakes. I still today, I make cooking mistakes, and that's okay. The sense of accomplishment comes over time as you practice, and you will learn and you will get better. And we host au pairs every year. These are young women, usually in their late teens, from Germany, for childcare. And one of the things I do with every au pair is I teach them cooking. And they usually come with almost no cooking skills, right? They come directly from a family where the parents cooked for them. And by the time they are done with 1 year with us, they can bake their own sourdough bread, they can make their own yogurt, they can make all sorts of soups and meat dishes and Indian curries and Thai dishes and you name it, and including German dishes and Turkish dishes from my ancestry. So it's really just a matter of just do it.
And actually, one benefit I can think of right now, as you're talking about these things, is that if people have a particular sensitivity, and it seems like just about everybody does nowadays, for example, if someone's trying to avoid gluten and they want to heal their gut, so they're going to avoid gluten for a time, you can tailor make your foods in your kitchen for that specific need. So you can avoid spending an arm and a leg at a Whole Foods, for example, for a carton of gluten-free crackers, and you can actually tailor make your own, which is better for you and for your health.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny you mentioned gluten intolerance, because I actually developed a gluten intolerance myself about 3 years ago. And what I found was, eating out, even when they tell you there's no gluten, I would have these reactions. I don't know if it was cross-contamination or what. But when I cook at home, I don't have the reactions. And the wonderful thing is, we live in this day and age with the internet, and there are recipes for everything out on the internet, and there are gluten-free versions of many of the dishes that might be ordinarily gluten-rich that we might be used to.
Coming up, Nevra gives us some practical tips on meal planning and how it can inspire the whole family to get in the mood for the week's menu. We want to pause now and recognize our sponsors, Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements offer New Zealand-sourced bone marrow and nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, spleen, and more in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Traditional peoples and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ in the individual. So, a person with a weak heart, for example, was fed the heart of a healthy animal. A person with urinary ailments would be given a kidney from a healthy animal, and so on. Visit ancestralsupplements.com today to see what it can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. We are committed to helping you and the world eat better. We are advocates for food freedom and international initiatives, helping the world rediscover ancestral food ways. Join hands with us by giving to the foundation. Right now, it's our fundraising drive. You can give a gift of any size, and it will go toward our current mission of education, research, and activism. Just go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the donate button. And thank you. So, Nevra, let's get into some practical tips now about how to get going with all this cooking stuff. I think you said something earlier about meal planning. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it's been helpful for you?
Maybe I can share a story about a friend of mine. She and her husband are very busy. He is pretty high up in the government, has a very demanding job. She's a high-powered attorney. They've got 3 kids, very busy life. And, eating well is important to them, but they usually don't have the time. And so one day I went over there on a Sunday, and I was talking to them about this challenge. And I said, I have an idea. Let's do a meal plan. And they kind of looked at me, and I just went over to their freezer, and I opened it, and I said, boy, you've got a lot of stuff in here. I opened the fridge, and again, the pantry, just packed. And I said, well, why don't we use this stuff up? So what do you do with this ingredient, this ground meat and this chicken? What do you do with it? They had a bunch of frozen berries, etc. And so they just started talking through, oh, well, there's this chicken dish we make, with the ground meat, they make sloppy joes. And so I just made this list of different dishes that they make with these ingredients. And then what I did was I reordered it, and I said, okay, well, would this work as a meal plan for the week? On Monday this, on Tuesday that, and mixing it up. So you get one salad, you get a soup, you get a chicken dish, you get a beef dish. And we made the plan, and I just left it there. And it was halfway through the week, and they called me and they said, Nevra, this is amazing. We've had so little stress this week around meals, and we were able to cook all the meals just because we knew in advance what the plan was, and we didn't have to stress out at 4 or 5 p.m. on the day of dinner, what are we going to do for dinner? Because we already knew even the day before, so we knew just take out and thaw out the chicken, etc. And it just made cooking and eating healthy so much easier. So I would say meal planning is something, it sounds simple and straightforward, but the fact is almost nobody I talk to really does it. And even I sometimes struggle to find the discipline on Sunday, which, for me, that's the Sunday activity. It only takes me about maybe 15 to 20 minutes, but I make a point of making my meal plan for the full week. And that way I know what we're doing. And it also gets all the family members in the mood, because what happens is when you're hungry, you often start craving food that isn't necessarily that healthy. But if you start your day and go through your day knowing that potato leek soup or Cobb salad, or like last night I made an Indian curry, knowing that that's what's going to be for dinner tonight, your body actually adjusts and gets in the mood for it and prepares. And I think you're less likely to stray and go and cop out for that Chinese takeout, for instance.
Oh my gosh, I love it. And you make it sound so wonderful. I would love to try that curry dish, by the way.
Well, I hope you're not afraid of spice.
No, I'm not. I'm totally not. Now let's talk again about how we can get family members involved. I think it's important to get them on board. I can just picture a lot of parents, I've been there myself, feeling overwhelmed at the prospect of being by themselves in the kitchen, chopping up the onions, doing all this work. It just seems like too much. What do you recommend?
It's a lot easier if everybody just gets, I would say, small little tasks that that are fun. And I mean, for instance, my 6-year-old, right? He helps. Like the other day, he wanted to help with the beans because he wants to start learning how to use a knife. He's a young boy, he likes knives. So it was just cutting off the ends of the beans, right? And so I gave him that task. I watched him to make sure that he's not going to hurt himself, but he's good with the knife, and he really enjoyed that little task. Or it might be shelling the peas. Sometimes it's standing on the stool and stirring something on the stove. It gives him this sense of participation. He really likes sometimes rinsing the salad because it means he gets to use the salad spinner, which spins, and that's really fun. And sometimes it's just going out in the garden and picking the lettuce or picking the mint or the herbs. And my husband also. The thing is, my husband tends to not, I mean, cooking is not his thing. He tends to, let me do all that. But once in a while, I get a little overwhelmed and stressed out that he's not helping. And he picks up on that. And so he does step in, and I give him tasks that are doable, that are not going to, my husband has a knack for injuring himself in the kitchen. He once cut himself with a baguette. Not with the knife, but with the baguette himself. He is so talented at hurting himself. So I give him very safe tasks, and that way, by spreading it out, no one gets overwhelmed, no one gets stressed out. And again, we have the au pair to help out as well. And so if she joins us for meals, and so if everybody is participating, then it's more of a sort of shared accomplishment, I guess, when the meal is finally served.
Nevra, when I hear you speaking, I recognize your background in supply chain management and logistics. It really comes through. And it occurs to me that I wonder if you would be willing, Nevra, to write an article for our listeners that we could post in the show notes, kind of giving us a Kitchen 101 or Kitchen Basics primer for how to get the family involved, kind of how to get started and how to get organized a little bit. The idea being, if you give us a tool like that, we would save time and energy in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, as you mentioned that, yeah, I did work in the past a little bit in logistics and warehouse management, supply chain management. And one thing that meal planning kind of relates to is also I'm going to call it inventory management, which is knowing what you have in the fridge and in the pantry. And one of the advantages of planning your meals for the week all up front is that then you can really do just 1 or 2 shopping trips during the week, as opposed to what I used to do in the old days before children, which is go to the store almost every day that I intended to cook. And that's, of course, not very efficient. So one of the habits that I've tried to get the family into, and this is every member of the family, anybody who is going to open the pantry or open the fridge and pull something out has this task, and that is, when an item, the honey, the maple syrup, the carrots, the peaches, whatever, whenever it starts to run low, there is a piece of paper on the counter, and they have to add to it that item so that we never run out of those basic staples. And by doing that, when it's time to go to the store, we have both the things that we happen to be running low on, and we have the things for that weekly meal plan for the upcoming week. So it just makes the whole shopping experience much less stressful.
And what do you do when you're not home, Nevra? How do you manage cooking or eating well when you're on the go?
Oh yeah, that's a good question, because especially when I was trying to get to the bottom of my digestive issues, which ultimately turned out to be in large part this gluten intolerance. I had a very restrictive diet for a while, and so I think there's 2 things that I do. I tend to travel a lot because I'm in software sales, and one thing I do is I travel with some food. So, for instance, when I'm at home, I make oatmeal for breakfast, but when I travel, we actually make our own granola. So I use oats and seeds and nuts, and then I make the sauce with the topping with the maple syrup and honey and coconut oil and clarified butter. So I'll just pack some of that in a Ziploc bag, And, you can't really travel these days with liquids so well, but when I get to my destination, most places I go to have a Whole Foods, for instance. So I will
Mhm.
take the Uber to the Whole Foods. I will get the better quality milk. If I'm in a state that allows raw milk, I'll buy some raw milk. And then I might get some cheeses. I might get some cured meats. I might get some nuts. I might get some easy to eat, doesn't require cutting fruits like berries. Uh, and, I went the other week, I went to this oil and gas company and I had all of these snacks that I picked up at the local Whole Foods with me. And I actually put them on the conference table, and there was also candy on the table. And everyone was so excited, and they never reached for the candy. They reached for these healthy snacks that I bought, and the meetings went well and everybody felt good. And who knows, maybe there's a connection to the
Mhm.
healthy snacks that were available. But this is, I guess it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is I feel like, at least in this country, office environments generally are not always conducive to healthy eating. But I think if those of us who work for these companies could, just help a little bit, bring in some healthy snacks, contribute, teach our coworkers that it is possible to eat healthy on the run, and mix in a few healthy snacks. It's a way to start taking baby steps to a healthier lifestyle.
And trust me, I am all about that. I am all about taking small incremental steps for lasting change in our health. So that sounds fantastic. Nevra, I really feel like you've helped us get a handle on the philosophy of why we should cook and even given us some practical tips on how to get going. Is there anything else you think we should address before we start to wrap up?
Well, I guess going back to my comment about baby steps, I feel like, a lot of my friends, they come over and they see that I'm cooking so much from scratch. And, I'm just in a different place on my journey to healthier eating and living. And we're all at different places. And I don't by any means want to suggest that everybody needs to immediately start baking their own sourdough bread and churning your own butter. But if you can start to make incremental little improvements, like for instance, there's a friend of mine who he's got some inflammatory issues and he wants to start eating better. And he's going out to eat probably a good 4 or 5 times a week, either eating out or getting takeout. And so for him, my suggestion was a meal plan that just incorporates eating at home, cooking 2 more nights a week as a starting point. And in that case, he also wants to try to go gluten-free. And so what we did was we listed out all the restaurants that he likes to go to, and let's limit it to those that are more likely to be gluten-free. And then let's create a list of gluten-free recipes that actually, when I sat down with him and I said, give me a bunch of recipes that you like that might not have flour in them. And he started thinking, and he rattled off a good 10 or 20 recipes. He happens to be Greek, and there's a lot of dishes from that part of the world that are naturally gluten-free. They're rice or they're potato-based.
Hmm.
Um, I think his wife is Korean, so also there's a lot of, bone broth-based soups. And we managed to create this really nice list. And again, we go back to the meal planning. It's very doable if you can take the time to do that planning and then, again, ease into it, right? Just make little incremental improvements, and every month or few months, you go a little bit further, right? And the 80-20 rule is one I believe in, which is, even I don't eat healthy 100% of the time, but I think that if I treat my body well and I eat well 80% of the time, then the 20% of the time that, I'm going out with my colleagues and customers and I'm not eating great, I think I've equipped my body to be able to handle it and not have as big a negative reaction.
I think that's a good word, Nevra. I feel like a lot of our listeners are almost afraid of eating out at times, really concerned they're going to be eating conventional meat that's gotten antibiotics or what have you. So you're really reminding us it's all going to be okay. And then there are other listeners who might just think, wow, I would love to get to that 80% mark of eating well 80% of the time. So we have a whole range of folks listening, and I think you've really hit the sweet spot in helping all of us. So I want to wrap up, Nevra, with a question I often pose at the end here. If the listener could do one thing to improve their health, or in this case, I might say if they could do one thing to get cooking, what would you recommend that they do?
I would recommend they sit down and create a meal plan for a full week and see how it goes.
Excellent. And here's an idea. We are on Instagram at Weston A. Price and on Twitter at Weston A. Price. So if you all go for that, use the hashtag meal plan and tag us, and we will let Nevra know that you tried it. How does that sound?
That sounds great. And by the way, I do have a blog at turnyourown.com, and the latest article is specifically about meal planning, so feel free to check that out.
Absolutely. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time today, Nevra. We appreciate you. My guest today was Nevra Ledwon. For more on Nevra, visit her blog, turnyourown.com. For today's show notes and resources that we mentioned, including an article that Nevra wrote just for us, go to our website, westonaprice.org, and go to the podcast page and look for the show notes for episode 147. If you are enjoying this podcast, go ahead and subscribe through Apple Podcasts so you don't miss a thing, and rate and review us while you're there as well. We are closing in on 300 reviews. Help us hit that mark, and thanks in advance. Next week, we are going to talk about how to really get cooking. This episode was primarily on the why. Next week is on the how. Nevra walks us through a week in the life of someone who does meal planning, and she tosses a few simple recipes in the mix. I was drooling by the end of the conversation, which made me glad that this is a podcast and audio only right now. But I was also inspired and empowered during our conversation, and I know you will be when you tune in as well. Hey, and let's keep in touch, everybody. I'm on Instagram at holistic_Hilda. I've got stories and sometimes even live interviews with farmers and friends that I come across. Also, you can follow me for behind the scenes on this show and just behind the scenes on me. Hey, and if you're in the DC area this August, come on out to our special event called The Nourished Life on August 18th. It's a Saturday, and we're going to be with Sally Fallon Morell, a panel of farmers. We're going to have farm fresh food. It's going to be amazing. You can find this event on the westonaprice.org event page, or just go to Eventbrite and look up The Nourished Life. We hope to see you there. And whether you're near or far, there is a super brief listener survey on the podcast page of the westonaprice.org website. So go to that podcast page and just take it for us. It'll just take a second, I promise, and it will help us get to know you better and know how to better meet your needs. Finally, a quick thank you to our faithful team of podcast interns. Post-production assistants include Cynthia Castro Cohen Enriquez, Deirdre Beard, Diva Rizvi, Melanie Ahern, and Ari O'Hara. Cheryl Huftelin helps with social media. Mary Hine, Olga de Villiers, and Joy de los Santos help boost sponsorship and help with special projects. Our listening team includes Heather Carpentier and Victor Coseto, and Amy Matias helps with transcriptions. So that's it, everybody.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.